Don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning. Self-driving cars, smart cities, Internet of Things. With these phrases increasingly gracing the headlines, you may be wondering, what is the future of urban transportation? Well, wonder no more. To give us all the keys to this fascinating subject, we have a man who knows a lot about cars, driving around cities, and disruptive ideas. He is behind a company that has completely disrupted, silence at the back, that has completely disrupted the transport sector in the cities as we knew it, and is now changing the logistics structures of cities around the world. That company, everybody knows it, is called Uber, and he's the general manager for Southern Europe. Please welcome Carles Lloret.
Thank you. Perfect. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organization for inviting us to be here today. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is about the future of urban mobility. I'd like to talk about how can we tackle congestion, pollution, and parking in our cities by putting more people in fewer cars, and ideally even greener cars. And how can we make that happen? With technology. Technology we all carry in our pockets, mobile phones that we're used to using every day. And the truth is that we're very used to consuming today via our smartphones pretty much everything. We buy movies, we rent music, we play video games, we book lodging, we transport ourselves with mobile phones. But that's something which wasn't so obvious some years ago. Just 6 years ago, Uber was born, and it was born in Paris, in Europe. It was born out of an event happening in Paris in 2009, where our founders, Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp, were trying to find a taxi to get back home. It was late at night, it was snowing, and pretty much everyone knows that getting around in Paris with a taxi at night is difficult. So they were thinking, wow, it's amazing how many cars are going in front of us. Half of them, or most of them, are empty. So why couldn't we just tap a button and get a ride? And with that idea in mind is how the company was founded. The company was called Uber, and this is the app that probably many of you are familiar with today. It's an app where basically you can open the app, register as a user, you can introduce your payment method, and then you just simply need to tap a button and get a ride. You see who's going to take you where, and then you just need to get out of the car, pay for your service via electronic payment with a credit card, and then you're off to go. So that simplicity in the technology that we put in place was clearly key to transform the way people were getting around cities, because suddenly you don't need to buy any car anymore. Suddenly, instead of having 30 cars serving 30 people, what you have is one car serving 30 people. And that's a fundamental transformation in the way people get around. However, the way the company started in 2010 was in a way that wasn't the one that many people know Uber for today. The company started with a product called Uber Black. And Uber Black is a service that basically allows you to get around the city with high-end vehicles. These vehicles are Mercedes S-Class, E-Class, BMW Series 7, vehicles that most likely many people can't afford. And of course, this model was based under a circumstance where drivers were just taking a couple of rides per day, but these rides were actually very, very expensive. So the efficiency of that car was very low. The car was used very few times per day with a very high price. So we challenged ourselves and we said, hey, couldn't we put some technology in here so actually the utilization of the car increased? So with a higher utilization, prices could go down, so the combination of higher utilization with lower fares could reach more people and more audiences while drivers made the same amount of money. So we challenged ourselves, and the result of that challenge was actually a product called UberX. And UberX is our most well-known product in the world today, a product that operates today in more than 500 cities around the world, in 70 countries, every single continent. And it's a product which is basically transforming the way people get around. So that question we put ourselves on, can we make this happen? The answer was a strong yes. And the yes was because precisely we looked at numbers. We looked at how could we increase utilization of existing vehicles that were getting around the city. And we saw that in 2012, this is an example, an actual example from New York, utilization from the cars was about 25% of the time. So 75% of the time, the cars were either sitting idle or getting to get people in the car, trying to get to the car. So the question was, could we change that? And actually, we managed to do so. Utilization increased by double in just 3 years, which means prices could also have halved by 50%, and still the earnings for drivers would be the same. So what happened, for example, in New York and in other cities is that the average fare, the average price for a transportation, in this case as an example of a 5-minute ride, actually went down significantly. Went down significantly, which meant that more people could afford it and more people could get into those cars, which as a combination of higher efficiency and lower fares resulted in what we see here, drivers making either the same amount of money or even making more money. So that's the paradox. The paradox is that people are paying less for transportation, so little by little they can consider more and more leaving their cars at home, plus we're getting drivers to make more money or the same. But the second implication was interesting. The second implication was that traditionally, as you can imagine, Uber works very well in the city centers, where basically many people are opening the app and the efficiencies are very high. However, it's also true that as time goes by and the system scales, what you can see in this slide is how year over year, the spread and the footprint of Uber drastically increases, covers areas that actually taxis weren't even serving before. And what this means is that people that before couldn't afford to pay a taxi or even didn't have a taxi nearby, suddenly they have an alternative. So the implications are massive, because on one side, drivers make more money or the same as before. Second, riders are paying less money for transportation, which means more people can afford the service. And third, we're creating new job opportunities for people that can drive people around the city in locations where before no one was serving. Now, that's the picture today. However, as we all know, the mobility today in the world, but also in Spain, of course, is based on ownership. It's based on ownership of owning a car or buying a car. And that car ownership started decades ago. And it started mostly in the US, although the car was invented in Europe. It mostly started in the US, where many people were acquiring vehicles, owning vehicles, using them very, very little just to have a way to get around the city. There was no alternative. However, that picture is not really efficient. And although that video over there looks like it's a very American type of video, when you look at the reality about what's the number of cars being owned per market, per population, what you see is that actually a market like Spain has a higher penetration of vehicles than even the US. It's actually among the top 10 countries in the world. Now, that's very interesting, because suddenly we have a city which is congested, which needs alternatives for getting around, but today there are not that many alternatives. And the implications of that are pictures like this one. Pictures where basically what you see is, this is the M30, I believe, here in Madrid, congestion. And I'm pretty sure that many of you who may live in Madrid or may come to Madrid very often to visit, you will have realized that traffic, congestion, pollution is the thing here, like any other city in Spain or around Europe. So the question is, what are the implications of this? So the implications are quite severe, because on one side of things, what you have is that many, many people, actually more than 90% of people, are breathing air which is polluted and is above any recommended guideline in terms of pollution in the air. That's very interesting and very disappointing as well. Second thing we see is that 1/5 of all those emissions are done by cars, by those cars we own and we use so inefficiently. And the third thing we see as well is that there's an economic impact for this. There are 5.5 thousand million euros in Spain every year being lost because of traffic, congestion, and pollution. So the picture looks pretty bad. So the answer of cities, which one it is? So the answer of cities is obviously interesting, but definitely before getting into the answer, what you see is that the problem we just spoke about of congestion is just 4% of the times, the 4% of the time that the car is actually running. The other 96% of the time, the cars are sitting idle and stopped in parking lots. And for you to get a sense, around 20 or 30% of our cities today is used to store vehicles, which obviously doesn't make too much sense when you just could have them running every day and every time. And on top of that, what you have is that also between 20 and 30% of the time a car is driving is looking for a parking spot. So you can imagine the implications in terms of congestion it also creates. So, solutions to that cities put in place? Well, there's a solution which is pretty obvious, which is called public transportation. This is mass transit. This means that whenever there's a significant number of people going from the same place to another place, we can create lines where basically the efficiency, the space, and the pollution per square meter, and actually per person, are much, much lower. And that makes a ton of sense. And public transportation is clearly a structural solution to mobility issues in our countries. However, it's also true that public transportation has a structural problem, and it's a problem that still hasn't been solved, which is that public transportation cannot reach to everyone's doorstep. It cannot. It cannot because economically speaking, and from an environment perspective, it's not efficient. It doesn't make sense to put buses and trains everywhere because it doesn't make sense. So what's the solution to that? And that's where technology comes in place and where we link it back to solutions like Uber. What Uber is trying to do is three things. First thing, trying to get people connected to public transportation. So something we have here is the City of London. And in London, what we see, and that's very interesting, is that today, 30% of the rides at commuting times start or finish below 200 meters away from a train station or a tube station outside of the perimeter of the city, which means that many people who live in the outskirts, London, as you know, is an expensive city to live in, that need to live in the outskirts of the city, have an easy way to connect with an Uber directly to their best metro or tube line to be able to get to a destination in the city. And that 30% means that many people will stop using their cars to either get in the city or get around the city and need to park next to the tubes. So that's the first thing, or the first implication. Second implication, underprivileged areas. You know, in Paris today, for example, 1 out of every 10 rides start or finish in an underprivileged area. And that's interesting because normally, as you can imagine, underprivileged areas are also the ones that lack public transportation the most. So that's also an interesting angle where also solutions like Uber with low prices can allow people to get around their cities. And the third one is when do rides happen? And that's an interesting slide where you can see basically the evolution of how many rides happen per volume in those 10 cities by time of the day. And you can see basically that starting by, depending on the city, of course, and Madrid probably is more skewed towards the right, you can see that basically people, once the night comes, once public transportation is more scarce, is when people need more solutions. And especially in a situation where people drink and drive, it's important to offer solutions that let people not get the car and get a different way to get around the city. So that's very interesting. Now, we wanted to challenge ourselves a little bit more. And then we realized that in cities where we are big, cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Paris, London, etc., we realized that people, without being aware of that, were taking the same rides at the same time from the same place to the same place without knowing each other. So we thought, wow, couldn't we find a way in which we try to put these two people together, where people in real time, they request a car, they accept to share that car with someone, and get to the destination. And the implications are massive, because on one side, the car is more utilized, so drivers make more money. Second, as a rider, you pay only the proportional part of that ride, which means prices continue to go down, and more people can afford to pay for that. And third, instead of having 2 or 3 cars in parallel going from one place to the other, you suddenly have one, which is more complete. So we challenged ourselves, and the solution for this we called Uber Pool. Uber Pool is a service operating today in more than 20 cities in the world, and precisely does that. And when we looked at the implications of that, we realized they were massive. And this is a map, a live map of San Francisco, where you can see over time what is the congestion generated by Uber with UberX, the model where you can just get a car for yourself or you and your friends, or Uber Pool, where actually you're sharing with people real time that we're getting in the same destination. And as you can imagine, the implications of these are massive, and the amount of congestion you can decrease with this and pollution is also incredible. And actually, since we launched in Paris, for example, in July 15, which has been only a little bit more than a year, we've been able to save more than 100,000 liters of gas, and also been able to save more than 236,000 kilograms of CO2. And that's amazing, because that's precisely what all the municipalities around the world are trying to reduce. All of the cities in the world, for example, in Madrid, we have targets for 2020 to try and reduce pollution by between 10 and 15%. And things like this definitely help. For example, in the case of London, more than 2 million people in just 4 months have chosen to ride with Uber Pool. So as you can imagine, again, the implications of what's happening in the US are very rapidly happening as well in Europe. In the case of London and Paris, it's pretty obvious. So what I explained so far is how do we get more people in fewer cars, and that's the core of the company, and that's what we do. However, the other question as well is, well, and what about if these cars we put in the system are actually more sustainable cars, they're greener cars? What could happen if not only we try to reduce from 30 cars to 30 people, but from 1 car to 30 people? Plus, we put Uber Pool where basically you share the ride, so you have less cars on the road. Plus, on top of that, you have more sustainable vehicles. Then automatically, you're dramatically changing the congestion and pollution in our cities. So something we've been working on for the last months is an initiative we call internally Uber Green. And Uber Green is an initiative where we're trying to pilot and understand what is the implication of using alternative energies in transportation. And as you may know, alternative energies range from, obviously, diesel and gas are the traditional ones. Then you have natural gas, GLP, electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, and so on and so forth. So we try to understand the implications of those technologies. And in particular, the technology we're more focused on today is electric technology. We want to understand how can we use electric technology better, and how can we make sure this is actually also sustainable for partners. As you know, electric technology is a technology which is not, I wouldn't say getting started, but still needs a bit of time to mature. We've heard recently about new vehicles that will have a long range, new infrastructures being developed, and of course, these elements are fundamental to have a sustainable ecosystem of electric cars. So what we did is that we took the 3 biggest cities in Europe. We took Lisbon, Paris, and London. And what we did is that we tried and piloted how would that work. So we said, hey, how can we make sure that our biggest cities in Europe have also a way to get greener vehicles? And we piloted that. And out of that, we had many initiatives called Uber Green, which basically ranged from a pilot. We piloted, for example, in Lisbon with dozens of cars, how would that work? Also in Paris and also in London. But the question is, what happens in Madrid? In Madrid, as you know, every day, there are 2.5 million people getting around the city with a car. So Madrid also needs solutions, and for sure Madrid is starting to develop new alternatives, like building parkings next to the train stations, introducing electric bicycles, changing the energy for the buses, introducing new alternative models, but for sure it needs new solutions. So something we're going to do as Uber, starting this very same year, is introduce in Madrid for the very first time ever a fully electric product that you can actually choose. Historically, in the past, in other cities, the electric vehicles were inside the existing products normally, UberX, for example. In Lisbon, for example, it was just a pilot with a small number of cars and just for a small period of time. Madrid is going to be the first city to have a fully electric vehicle, 0 emissions. That means no engine, no small tank to cover for extra mileage, 100% electric. And that's going to happen before the end of this year, and we're really excited to make that happen. So that's the reality about mobility. Now, this is the restriction. And this restriction is very specific about Spain, but it's something that in other markets also exists, which is about how can we make this happen by complying 100% with the regulations today. So there are 2 main characteristics of the Spanish regulation that don't allow for this to happen in a scalable way, such as we saw in Paris and London. The first one is that sharing cars in Spain is illegal. You cannot rent a vehicle by the seats. A professional driver cannot go and say, hey, I want to rent you these 2 seats, and then I want to rent you these other seats, which means that Uber Pool in Spain today would not be allowed. And of course, as you can imagine, if we're trying to change the congestion and pollution of Madrid, of other cities in Spain, definitely that's a piece of regulation that doesn't seem to make too much sense. The second one is the cap on number of licenses. Spain is a licensed market, a very controlled and intervened market, where the regulation says that for every 30 taxis, there can only be one person driving people around with a private car. Only one for every 30 taxis, which means that the number of licenses in Madrid and in Spain is very low. In the case of London, for example, we have every week 35,000 people connecting to the application. In the case of London, in the case of Paris, we have around 15,000, 20,000 people connecting to the application. In Madrid, the whole market of licenses, the whole market, is 2,000. So as you can imagine, being the 3rd biggest city in Europe, the current regulations cap the option to grow and to make a business out of this and build new mobility alternatives. So that's definitely a restriction that makes things difficult in Spain, although we're trying to do our best to make it happen. And just to conclude on this, I think that definitely there's new technology out there that can make things very different and help our cities. But one question we always ask ourselves is what could have happened if we hadn't relied so much on acquiring vehicles? Would the cities be different today? Would we have different alternatives? Would we have greener spaces? And unfortunately, we will never be able to answer that question. No? However, today we have a second chance. We have technology that can help us make this happen. And what we think is that together with technology and smarter regulations, we could hopefully start regaining our cities back starting today. So thank you very much, everyone. Great pleasure to be with you.
Gracias, Carles. Me temo que no tenemos tiempo para Q&A, pero Carles va a estar por aquí. Sorry, I'm talking in Spanish. Oh, I'm sorry about that. There's no question, there's no time for Q&A. Sorry about that, but Carles will be around. I hope you all came by Uber to la nave.